This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Before I jump into my guest today, I have one of those special requests. For those of you out there that enjoy this podcast and you want to give a little love, go to Amazon, write a review. Go to iTunes, write a review of this podcast. Be proactive. Keep me motivated. Keep me finding good guests. I need the energy. I need the something. Well, I really don't need it. It's kind of self-motivated. But I would surely appreciate a little love on the reviews. Go give back and show me what you feel about this podcast, this craziness, my life. Let me know. I want to hear it. My little Michael Covel advertisements out of the way. My guest today is Jeffrey Miron. He is an American economist. He once served as the chairman of the Department of Economics at Boston University, currently teaches economics at Harvard. He also currently holds the position of Director of Economic Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. And for those of you that have a pulse, that know something about economics, you already know that Jeffrey probably has a very strong libertarian bent. Well, if you thought that, you guessed right, because he does. One little disclaimer on this episode. Unfortunately, the technical snafu happened, and I lost about 20 minutes of our conversation. But doing my level-headed best, I stitched together a couple of Jeffrey's presentations from other sources, and as it turns out, it became one very interesting episode. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jeffrey Miron. I know you are intimately involved with Cato, the Institute. Something kind of interesting to me about Cato, I've read some papers and stuff over the years. There was a great paper that someone did out of Cato about long-term capital management. But there's also a paper that's really interesting about drug policy toward a moral drug policy written by a trader named Richard Dennis. He's not on the Cato board anymore, but he had to have been on the board for over 20 years, which is really interesting because he was a feature of my second book. One of your current board members, Rebecca Dunn, is the wife of Bill Dunn, who was profiled in my first book. And I really have to commend my first meetings with Bill Dunn in the mid-1990s. Before I knew anything about his views on liberty, the handshake of the man at the time set me in motion, I think. I mean, it was almost like I didn't know anything about his views on liberty, but meeting him and seeing how he did things was such an influence. And then I've really kind of an interesting trader connection for me to Cato. I don't know if you're aware of any of the names and all that connection yourself.
I know all those names. I don't know those people especially well. I've met them a few times at Cato events. I certainly have noticed that a number of our contributors have backgrounds in finance or trading because it sort of makes sense. People who've done that have accumulated some wealth and therefore are in a position to make donations. I suspect there's some common thread that if you're in the trading industry, if you're in the finance industry, which is sort of based on merit, people are keeping score, there's not much push to think about the equity or the fairness of it. It's just who the smartest trader wins. That probably has a little bit of overlap with the libertarian perspective on the world.
Can I tell you what's really interesting, too, over the last 20 years observing the traders? The other overlap, Ayn Rand. It's like Ayn Rand is in the blood system of trading. It's like I'm right there too. You know, I'm a big fan. I mean, I love going back and watching her old Mike Wallace interview from decades ago. I think that's fabulous. Going back in time, explain to my audience what got you going down the liberty path in particular. And when did that first hit you? As a young guy? I mean, was there a moment, something where it just struck you? You're like, liberty, damn it, this is where I'm at.
I'll answer that in a couple parts. First, I came to it more as an economics person, not a liberty person. Economics gives a lot of reasons why we should be skeptical about government intervention. Not because economics teaches us that markets do everything perfectly, but it does suggest that markets do things reasonably well in many circumstances, most circumstances. And more importantly, I would say, economics teaches that there are huge unintended consequences of trying to fix the market or fix other private institutions. It's not that the market is perfect and the interventions are terrible. Markets are imperfect, but the interventions are even worse. And so the right choice is still, generally speaking, the market or the private arrangements. Now, in terms of a moment, I had started working on the drug legalization issue kind of by dumb luck back in the late 80s, early 1990s, and had published a paper making the case for legalizing drugs in one of the standard economics journals. And a friend I was chatting with said, I read your piece and I agree with it. I really enjoyed it, but I just hope you're not one of those nuts who thinks that guns should also be legal. And I actually hadn't given it much thought at that point. I was not a libertarian at that point. This was when I was well into my career. I grew up in a very liberal, not classically liberal, modern liberal leaning household. I stopped and thought for a second and said to him, well, all the reasons for keeping drugs legal would apply more or less similarly to keeping guns legal. All the unintended negative consequences of outlawing any market are going to be the same, so why wouldn't I also want to keep guns legal? Then I just sort of kept thinking more from there and decided I wanted to evaluate the sort of conservative positions a little bit more carefully and think about which ones I disagreed with and which ones I actually had some sympathy for. And then the other moment was I did a visit at Harvard from where I was teaching at the time at Boston University, and they said, you can teach a course about anything you want. I decided to teach about libertarianism, and I went through all the standard policy issues and tried to make the best case I could make for the small government or no government approach, and ended up realizing I was sort of convinced that I really was a pro-liberty small government person sort of across the board, whether it was social issues or economic issues or foreign policy issues.
I'm curious, in 1986, where were you living? Do you remember?
1986, I was living in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Michigan, okay.
As an assistant professor at the University of Michigan.
I knew you were pretty close to, at that point in time, being in the Boston area. And so, in 1986, I was a senior in high school. I was living in the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia. I watched all of my friends in high school, Catholic high school, try cocaine for the first time. I said to myself, and this was after Len Bias, who was living 30 miles away in College Park, Maryland, after he had just doused himself. I was a huge Celtics fan at the time. They had just won the world championship. They happened to have the high pick. They take Bias, the closest thing to Michael Jordan. It was an eye-opener for me. And I said, I'm not going to choose that path. But you know what? At that point in time, I wasn't going to put a bag over my friends' heads and say, hey, man, you really shouldn't be doing coke. Bias just died. But it was like, why should this get beyond the personal choice at that moment? A simple example, very noteworthy for people that recall Len Bias. But okay, I saw Len Bias die. I'm not going to do coke. My friends saw Len Bias die. They're doing coke. But why should the government be in the middle of all those transactions? If Len Bias died doing coke, you can't stop the guy from doing coke. He did the damn coke and died.
I obviously agree with you. The government shouldn't be involved in people's decisions about using drugs, alcohol, gambling, prostitution, any of the standard vices, victimless crimes, and so on. People can point to the fact, who advocate prohibition can point to the fact that some people suffer bad outcomes from using coke, like Len Bias. Of course, some people die in automobiles every day, and we don't think that's a reason to outlaw automobiles. It might be a reason to want to have seat belts. It might be a reason to have speed limits, but it's certainly not a reason to outlaw automobiles. Now, how do you reconcile those two different things? I think many people just won't accept the notion that if I happen to want to be intoxicated or under the influence of whatever substance, that's perfectly okay, that's not any better or worse than if someone wants to go watch a movie or listen to an opera or read a book or any other private choice. There's this puritanical streak that says being intoxicated is wrong, that it's not a good or an acceptable way to derive enjoyment. I don't share that view. I think that policy should be neutral about how people choose to spend their time, spend their money, and what things they want to put in their bodies.
So when you're behind the scenes, because you get a chance to rub elbows in your various minglings around with people that probably have these puritanical leanings, when you're behind closed doors, do they drop their guard down and say, Jeffrey, and we're going to dive into some of the specifics of how you break down the various aspects of drug prohibition But behind closed doors, do some of the puritanical types, do they drop the guard down and say, of course, Jeffrey, you're right, this is crazy, but we've got constituencies and we've got groups that want this and want that, so we've just got to be illogical. What do they say behind closed doors to you? Because you've got the winning argument. I mean, I don't know how it's debatable.
I think there's a range of things. I think it's a good illustration of this theme that runs through lots of libertarian commentary on policy that's known as the Bootleggers and Baptists theme. A lot of people don't necessarily want to say that they're opposed to people making their own decisions. They kind of are willing to accept that, except they also believe, without being very critical, the claims that people have trouble making rational decisions on their own and that these substances are necessarily or typically very harmful. So then they're kind of hiding behind this allegedly benevolent paternalism. They're trying to do the right thing by helping people rather than interfering with people's liberty or free choice to engage in these activities by relying on the idea that people are making mistakes and that therefore government can come in and help people protect them from themselves. Now, it relates to the bootleggers part because, of course, there also are people who are taking these positions for reasons that are pure self-interest, that are not based on any, in my view, misguided, but nevertheless meant to be benevolent paternalism. These are people who are in criminal justice. These are people who are in the treatment sector. These are politicians who find it advantageous to rant against drugs as an evil because it helps them get elected. There are many, many cases where there's both a Baptist justification, we're helping people in some way, but also a bootlegger aspect. This is really just somebody's naked self-interest, special interest that's supporting this interventionist policy. And then the bootleggers get to hide behind the Baptist, the do-good veneer, and lots of those policies end up being successful in the political marketplace, even though you and I agree they're doing lots of harm.
We don't have them here on the conversation, but give those hypothetical Baptists right now that are listening, give them some data, connect some money spent and connect some crime statistics, homicide rates, etc. Connect that storyline there, because I know you know these numbers like the back of your hand. Give people a feeling for the do-gooders out there. So, okay, we're going down this path, we're spending all this money, and here's the results.
We are spending, as a country overall, state, federal, local, something like $50 to $60 billion a year on criminal justice activities, police, prosecutors, prison guards, et cetera, in order to the attempts to enforce the drug laws. Of course, we're not enforcing it very effectively. There still are significant drug markets, and most people who want to consume these substances are able to consume the substances, albeit at somewhat elevated prices. We're also foregoing a similar order of magnitude, something like $50 billion a year in tax revenues that all levels of government together could collect if we legalized drugs and treated them similarly to other legal goods, or perhaps similarly to alcohol and tobacco, where they face somewhat higher tax rates, but nevertheless relatively modest tax rates, so that we don't drive the market underground. $100 billion a year difference in the overall U.S. budget deficit. That turns out not by itself going to solve the fact that we have this long-term fiscal imbalance, but it's still a step in the right direction, and we would get that while getting all the other benefits of legalization, reduced crime, corruption, interference with people's ability to use these substances medicinally, and so on.
Yes, unfortunately, this is about the point in time where the pixelization of our conversation became too much. As an extra, this presentation from Jeffrey talks about trade-offs, a great reminder for a world that wants to scream about this and be emotional about that. Listen to what a very grounded voice has to say about economic trade-offs.
Economics does two different kinds of analyses. We do ones that are referred to as positive, okay, which means that they're descriptive, they're predictive. They just try to say, what do we expect to happen in certain situations? Okay? Like science tries to predict what happens if you hold a ball at shoulder height and you let go. It says there's this thing we can't see or measure called gravity, and it pulls it down to the floor. Okay? The second type of economic analysis is known as normative, and it makes a judgment about which policies are best. Okay? So the term positive, of course, is incredibly annoying, one of many ways in which economists use everyday words to mean something completely different. It doesn't mean it's a good analysis or it's saying anything and it is good. It's saying we're just trying to understand the science of exactly how things work. The normative analysis, okay, makes a judgment. Okay? And as you'll see, we need to make additional assumptions, okay, in order to get from the positive to the normative. So the two are related, in particular, positive analysis, figuring out what will happen if government does policy X versus policy Y, okay, clearly may inform your views over whether policy X is better than policy Y, okay, but it's not the same thing, and you have to say something additional to conclude that one policy is better than another. So positive economics is trying to be scientific. We have models of how people or firms or governments behave. We test these models with data. Okay? So in principle, okay, economics is like physics. Okay? Now, my son, who wants to be a physicist, just laughs uproariously when I say that. Of course, economics is way less precise than physics is. Why? Mainly because economists can't do experiments. We don't have a parallel universe in which Ben Bernanke did not become Fed chair or the government did not conduct the TARP bailouts, and we get to observe what happened in that otherwise identical, okay, version of the United States of the world. We can't do that for most interesting economics questions, okay? But in principle, okay, we're trying to do things like physics. We posit a set of models, and then we test those models with data, and that part is designed to be and should be value-free. Two different decently trained economists should agree on any positive analysis, subject to normal, scientific uncertainty. There's some things we don't know about, and so of course there might be some room for disagreement. So the standard supply and demand model that most of you have heard of, okay, is a standard positive economic model. It tells us what's going to happen if more people want to buy a particular good relative to the previous period. That's going to shift the demand curve out, raise the price, increase the quantity sold. There's no values there. There's no judgment. There's nothing necessarily good or bad. It's just a model that predicts what will happen under certain exogenous changes. Now, any analysis, okay, has to think about two things. Okay? It has to think about the constraints that are faced by the people in those settings, in those models, in those examples, and it has to think about how people make choices. And these are two completely separate and really important things that interact. Okay? Lots of the criticism you hear about economists and economics focuses on the second component. People allege that we as economists assume that everybody's hyper-rational, that everybody has all the necessary information, that they only care about their utility or their wealth or whatever. Okay? That's really, first of all, not right, but second of all, it's missing a crucial part of what makes economics economics, which is the first component, the fact that people face constraints. Their choices are not unconstrained, whatever their objective function is, okay, for those choices. Okay? So I'm going to go through those two pieces, okay, in succession. So if you had to define economics in one line, economics is just the observation that resources are scarce or resources are finite. There's only so much stuff. At any moment in time, the rate at which we can produce new stuff over time is finite. We can't just assert that we should double GDP between this year and next year. There are limits. There are things that constrain the amount of resources we have. And this, to the extent economics is a science, this is part of it. This is a fact. This does not have anything to do with whether people are rational or not, whether they have psychological influence or not. This is just something that we have to accept. Okay? Accounting identities are identities. They always hold. Constraints are constraints. So one way to describe economics says we believe the laws of arithmetic. Okay? We believe that 2 + 2 is 4. It's never 5 or 7 or 86. And you'll be amazed at how often you listen to statements by politicians and other advocates of policy that want you to believe that they can make 2 + 2 be something other than 4. Okay? We'll see lots of examples in a few minutes. So let's look at examples of the standard constraints. We think that consumers are constrained by their budgets. Firms are constrained by the technology they have available to make stuff and by the market. And governments are constrained in particular by something I'll explain in more detail in a minute called the present value budget constraint. So constraints for consumers. Think about a really, really simple case first. You have a consumer who has a given amount of income at a moment in time. You can imagine, say, someone with $50 in the wallet. They walk into a grocery store. This is pre-ATMs, pre-credit cards, debit cards, all that stuff. So that day, as you walk in the grocery store, there's only so much you can purchase. Whatever your choices are, say there are two goods, X and Y, and each has a price, piece of X or piece of Y, the total amount you spend has to be less than or equal to the amount of money you brought with you when you went into the store. And that's true whether your choices are rational or not. It's true whether you happen to like ice cream or you happen to like steak or you happen to like vegetables. Your choices have to satisfy the constraint. Okay? So there are bounds on what a consumer might do regardless of how we think that consumer is likely to behave. Now, if we had a dynamic setting, slightly more realistically, people don't just live in an instant in time. They earn income, they save, they accumulate, work, and so on. They might be able to borrow in many settings. It's still true that there's a constraint. It's just slightly more complicated. We know that their lifetime consumption cannot exceed their lifetime income, plus whatever gifts they might have gotten from friends or parents, plus any inheritance, plus any borrowing. But the amount of resources your parents might give you is finite. The amount that the bank is willing to lend to you is finite. So still, even when we look in this intertemporal way, okay, each consumer faces a constraint that puts bounds on the consumer's choices. Okay? Might seem sort of obvious, okay, but it's really, really, really important. Here's an example of why it's really important. When we talk about whether tax cuts are going to stimulate the economy, okay, people say, oh, consumers will have more disposable income if we cut taxes, so they'll go out and spend more. Okay, but if those consumers have any brains, okay, they should think to themselves, you know what, the government's not going to have resources, okay, forever to keep making tax cuts. At some point in the future, it's going to raise taxes to pay back the borrowing it did just now. That means that my taxes are going to go up in the future by roughly the amount that they were cut just now. Therefore, my lifetime resources hasn't really changed. Okay? So I actually can't afford to spend anything more than I could before my taxes were cut, okay? Because I know that over my lifetime, that's all going to average out. Okay? We'll see that again, okay, in another minute. Okay? If you think about that, that then says government's attempt to stimulate the economy with tax cuts may be much less effective than it's assumed to be in the Keynesian model. Well, why? The Keynesian model just says people are only thinking about today, they completely ignore the future in making their choices. That's not realistic and raises this huge issue. Firms, of course, face constraints. What do I mean by firms? Any organization, nonprofit, for-profit, whatever, that takes inputs, okay, and makes outputs. Okay? So firms obviously face technological constraints. Okay? They can only get a given quantity of inputs of output from the inputs that they have. Okay? And so they can't just respond to everything as they would like. Okay? If you've read the biography of Steve Jobs, you see really cool illustrations of this. He would be yelling and screaming at his engineers, no, the iPhone has to have these characteristics. It has to have this much battery life and this kind of screen and all. And they'd say, no, it won't all fit in there. You can't do that. Now, of course, Steve Jobs was famous for pushing them really hard and sometimes making them work hard enough that they did figure out a way. So the production, they shifted the production function over time, but with great effort and resources. Okay? So firms have to take technologies as given. Sort of even more important, or maybe less sort of obviously, firms have to accept the market. The demand for any firm's commodities are downward sloping, meaning the higher the price the firm charges, the less it will be able to sell. Okay? So firms might have some ability to nudge that relation. If you advertise or market your product well, maybe you can sell a little bit more for a given demand curve. But that takes resources and has limits. So firms can't just assume that they can sell whatever they want, okay, at any price they want, okay, because the market imposes this relation, the downward sloping demand curve. Let's look at an extreme case of that because it's useful and comes up. And this specific example comes up in lots of cases. People complain about monopolies. They say monopolies are evil. Why? Because they can charge whatever they want. Okay, well, that's just nonsense if you think it all in terms of constraints. Okay, why? Because if they could charge whatever they wanted, the price of an iPhone would already be $8 million a phone or $8 billion a phone. They obviously can't charge whatever they want. Their ability to set a higher price is constrained by the market demand curve. If Apple sets a higher price, they're going to sell fewer iPhones. Okay, so there's a trade-off. Even a monopolist knows it will lose sales, okay, when it raises price, and it's going to choose some balance between higher price per unit and the number of units it sells, okay, in setting its policy. Okay. Finally, constraints for government. Okay, this one is crucial. I sort of alluded to it a little bit already. Governments obviously raise revenue by taxing or borrowing. Lots of people think that government expenditure can do all sorts of beneficial things. Hire the unemployed during recessions, give free health care to everyone, provide public schools, and on and on and on. Billions of examples. So if the government can always just tax more or borrow more, okay, and these things are good that it might do with that revenue, why doesn't it do all of that and more for everyone all the time? Because the taxing power is finite. The particular relation is referred to by economists as the present value budget constraint. That just means the sum of all the taxes the government raises, okay, can't be, sum of all of its expenditure can't be more than the sum of all the taxes it collects, People aren't going to keep lending to a government forever, okay, if it is trying to spend way more than its economy could ever justify. We've seen this in dramatic fashion in Greece and Portugal and Italy and Spain over the last several years. Those countries had paths for their expenditure that they could never pay for because their economies weren't large enough or growing fast enough to generate nearly enough tax revenue. People started to recognize it, so what did they do? They stopped lending to those countries, or only lending at extremely high interest rates, which made the situations even worse. Okay? And so government's power was finite. Okay, many of you have heard of the Laffer curve. That's one way of embodying the fact that the government faces constraints. As it raises tax rates and tries to take more and more, it's going to induce more avoidance and evasion. At some point, when the tax rate gets to be 100%, it collects zero revenue, okay, because no one's going to ever bother to earn any income, or certainly not report that income to the government, if 100% of it is going to be taken away. Okay? And as I mentioned, you might think, oh, the government, some people would like to argue the government can get around this by borrowing, but the borrowing has to be repaid, and the market will impose the constraint if you try to borrow more than your economy is ever able to generate. So this is relevant to talking about stimulus policies, to bailouts, to austerity programs. All of those have to face the reality that there's only so much stuff. All the things that the European governments have been doing to bail out Greece, they're not creating more wealth. They're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Why? Because that's what the budget constraint says. More for Peter, okay, or more for Greece and less for Germany, okay, doesn't change the overall total. Recognizing that there are these constraints already gives you a huge insight, okay, on what might be sensible policies in those situations. The fact that there are these constraints gets us to a slightly more interesting sort of point. Okay? The fact that constraints is incredibly important, but in some sense it's arithmetic, so it's sort of boring. Okay? But recognizing the constraints tells us that all of these economic agents face trade-offs. Okay? If you can't just decide you want to spend more on some things and not spend less on something else, you realize you have to spend less on other things to buy more of one thing, you face a trade-off. You have a choice. I might prefer more apples and fewer oranges, or vice versa, but I can't just have more of both. Equivalently, you can say that every choice, every decision to use resources involves an opportunity cost. When you buy one thing, you're losing the opportunity to use those same resources to buy something else. Why do you face that trade-off? Because of the fact that the resources are scarce. Okay? Now, just to make that crystal clear, consider the opposite case. Think about a consumer with infinite income. Well, the consumer just buys whatever it wants. It never has to say, oh, if I spend more on my house, I'll have less to spend on my car. It has an infinite income. It just buys a bigger car and a bigger house. Firms with infinite demand could sell whatever they want. Governments that could borrow without limit could, of course, fund any programs that they wish. But if you state those hypotheticals, it makes it crystal clear that they're insane and that we shouldn't think that way. Also probably reminds you of all the government policies which try to get you to think in that incorrect way. All these economic agents face these constraints, and therefore they face trade-offs. Okay? And that's going to be crucial to what effects government policies might have.
And this last piece, getting back to my conversation with Jeffrey, a little bit more from him on drug legalization.
What I want to talk about tonight is legalizing drugs. As most of you know, countries around the world, there's going to be a disclaimer, hang on. Countries around the world almost entirely outlaw the production, distribution, consumption of marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, so on and so forth. And most of these countries expend very substantial resources in the attempt to enforce those prohibitions. They arrest millions of people, incarcerate many of them, seize tons of assets, build lots of prisons, and so on and so forth. Now, the advocates of current policy of prohibition think that despite the fact that it's expensive, it's worthwhile, and they're relying on two arguments. Their two arguments are drug use is bad, okay, and implicitly, although they frequently forget to say this, they're assuming that prohibition reduces drug use, whether it's bad or not. So the advocates think that there's a benefit from prohibition that outweighs all its cost. I want to argue exactly the opposite based on three fairly simple points. So first, I want to challenge the view that it makes sense for public policy to systematically try to eliminate drug use or to substantially target all drug use. I don't think that's a sensible goal. And the position is simply, many people seem to think that they benefit from using drugs. Sometimes that's medicinally. Sometimes that's recreationally because people like being intoxicated. Sometimes it's because people want to appear cool to their peers or whomever. Okay? Whatever the reason, people go to great lengths despite all the risks of incarceration and so on to use drugs because they seem to think that it makes them better off. And in my view, policy should respect that. Now, why do lots of people nevertheless differentiate drugs from all other goods and think that somehow government should discourage drug use when it doesn't try to discourage all sorts of other things, which are also risky? They rely on two main arguments, paternalism and what economists call externalities. The paternalism says drugs are bad for you, but some people will do them anyway because they're myopic or irrational in some way, and we need to protect people from themselves. The externality argument says people may be rational in their own drug use with respect to their own costs and benefits, but they'll inadvertently harm other people by driving under the influence of drugs, by operating an airplane, by taking drugs during pregnancy and harming an unborn fetus, and so on. Now, both of those arguments, that drugs can cause harm, that some people make bad decisions about drugs from their own perspective, some people make bad decisions from the perspective of others, okay? Those arguments are clearly right, but there are two crucial things to note. First, those harms are routinely exaggerated by media scare stories. Yes, of course, drugs can be harmful, but whether they are and how harmful they are depends on the dosage. It depends on the setting. It depends on the expectations of the person using the drugs. It depends on zillions of things, and in many, many cases, okay, there are not significant harms and maybe no harms at all. Indeed, as I mentioned, many people think that they get benefits from using the drugs without any significant harms. Secondly, even granting that there are harms in many cases, there's nothing to distinguish the harms that drugs do from the harms that sometimes occur from alcohol, from skiing on double black diamond slopes, from driving on the highway, from eating too much Ben & Jerry's ice cream, and from zillions of other things that are risky, that are bad for your health or bad for other people if they're done excessively, if they're done in the wrong place, in the wrong time, or maybe at a very young age or whatever, but that can and are used routinely by lots of people for their enjoyment. And so much drug use, okay, should be regarded as just as legitimate as any other good or service in our economy. And at best, policy should be targeting those kinds of use which do harm other people, or perhaps which do harm the user, rather than taking as given that any drug-induced reduction is a desirable goal of policy. Indeed, some of the reduction in drug use that policy might accomplish, that prohibition might accomplish, is a cost, not a benefit, of drug prohibition. Second point, whatever you think about drug use, good, bad, or indifferent, okay, the question is whether prohibition actually reduces drug use. Even if you think drug use is incredibly evil, if prohibition doesn't have much effect, then that's not a very intelligent policy. Now, of course, it's plausible as a matter of theory that prohibition would discourage people from purchasing drugs because they fear arrest and incarceration, discourage people from supplying drugs by raising the cost of so doing. Okay? But the magnitude of that effect is an empirical question. Prohibitionists assume that if drugs were legal, there would be huge booms in drug use. There's not a shred of evidence to support that position. All the evidence suggests that prohibition has some effect, but very modest effects, maybe a 10% effect, maybe a 25% effect. But whatever the exact magnitude, it's not that we would be a nation of addicts, everybody doing drugs all day long. If drugs were legal, the reality seems to be dramatically different. There might be some increases in use by some people, but modest. Remember also, some of any increase should be regarded by policy as a good thing. If people who could use drugs responsibly without harming themselves or others have been abstaining because of prohibition, and then when prohibition is lifted, they decide, well, I might as well now enjoy the substance that I enjoy, that's a benefit of legalization. And so any reduction in use that we observe is partially reducing use that should be allowed that's a good thing, so the net benefit of any reduction is even smaller. Third point, okay, whatever you think about drug use, whatever the evidence says about how much prohibition reduces drug use, what's unequivocal is that prohibition has enormous unintended consequences that are the result of the policy, not the result of drug use per se. Prohibition generates violence. Why? Because in underground markets, people can't resolve their disputes with lawyers and courts and adjudication and so on. They resolve their disputes with guns, so lots more people get shot and die. Prohibition induces corruption because in underground markets you can't have ballot initiatives and lobbyists and so on to influence legislation and so on. So people engage in bribery and the like, okay, in underground markets. Prohibition generates income-generating crime because it raises drug prices, so more people are incentivized to steal to support their habits. Prohibition causes more overdoses and accidental poisonings because quality control is always much worse in a black market than it would be in a legal market. Prohibition spreads HIV because when drug prices are high caused by prohibition, people have an incentive to inject rather than other forms of administration, and prohibition generates restrictions on clean needles, so more people inject drugs rather than consuming in other ways. They share dirty needles and spread HIV. Much of the HIV in the US over the past 20 or so years has come from HIV drug use, not from sexual contact. Prohibition diminishes civil liberties because it's very hard to enforce a victimless crime except with aggressive tactics such as stop and frisk, such as racial profiling, such as knocking doors down in the middle of the night. Okay, so prohibition is bad for our general freedoms. Prohibition encourages restrictions on medical uses of drugs because the prohibitionists are so afraid to allow any legitimate air about drugs, okay, that they don't even want to allow research on the medicinal uses of marijuana. And of course, prohibition also has non-trivial direct costs for enforcement, for all the police officers who make the arrests, for all the judges, for all the prisons, and so on. My estimates suggest that's probably $50 billion a year in recent years in the United States. Prohibition enriches the traffickers at the expense of the general coffers of the government, okay, because we're not collecting normal tax revenues on the underground drug trade. The net effect of that might be another $50 billion a year. So legalizing drugs wouldn't solve America's fiscal problems, but it would put a non-trivial dent, okay, in our fiscal woes. So to summarize, no reasonable view suggests that policy should want to eliminate all drug use or even most drug use. Much drug use should be regarded the same way we regard all other risky activity. People get to choose what they do and what they don't do. Whatever your view, prohibition doesn't seem to be very effective at reducing drug use, so it's pure waste, okay, regardless of whether you think drug use is good or bad. And prohibition has these huge unintended negative effects. Now let me give my disclaimer before I finish. Nothing I've said is meant to say that anybody should or should not use drugs. As long as drugs are illegal, I actually hope you don't use drugs. I don't think people should break the law. They should work to change the laws that they don't like. Okay? So you can't go tell your parents, you can't go say to anyone, Professor Miron said I should use drugs. I got accosted several times the last 5 or 10 years by parents of my friends, my kids' friends, saying, I caught my kid smoking dope in our basement, and he showed me all these videos of you saying we should legalize drugs. That is not my message. My message is about the policy, not about whether drug use is good or bad for any individual. Okay. That having said, okay, I think it is time for a revolution. It's time for the U.S. to re-legalize drugs.
Again, it's a little unfortunate that we had that technical snafu and lost a few minutes of our conversation, but I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Jeffrey. And I hope you go check out his work. What he did tell me in our conversation, the best place to go check his work out, the Cato Institute. He is prolific. You will find all kinds of great papers there under his name. And of course, if you have any questions about my world, any questions about trend following, anything you'd like to know, if you'd like to receive some special extras from me, drop me an email. I'm really easy to reach. Michael@covel.com. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.